He fired me at 9:14 a.m. with a cardboard box he'd already packed himself. I smiled, picked it up, and left. 43 minutes later, I walked back in, and he finally learned my real name. They packed my pen before they even told me I was fired. That's the detail people always fixate on when I tell this story. Not the 19 years. Not the silver pen itself, or the man who gave it to me. Or even the fact that a 34-year-old in a tailored suit who'd been at the company for 6 months thought he had the authority to end my career with a cardboard box and a practiced smile. They fixate on the pen because the pen means someone planned this. Someone walked into my office while I wasn't there, opened my desk drawer, and decided that what I'd built over nearly 2 decades fit inside a medium-sized box from Staples. The pen was a gift from Arthur Tennant, my grandfather, the man whose name is on the building. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's the thing about this story. I have to resist the urge to hand you the ending first, because the ending only lands if you understand what came before it. If you understand who I was walking into that office that Tuesday morning in November, and who Martin Vale thought he was dealing with. He thought he was dealing with Clara Mercer. He had no idea he was dealing with Clara Tennant. And that distinction, that one small gap in his research, was going to cost him everything. I'd been director of financial operations at Tennant Manufacturing for 19 years when it ended. 19 years is not an abstraction. It is the particular smell of a Tuesday morning, burnt coffee from the second-floor break room, and the faint industrial tang drifting up from the warehouse floor 4 stories below. It is knowing, without checking the schedule, that Nina arrives 8 minutes early on Mondays and exactly on time every other day, because she coaches her daughter's soccer team on Sunday nights and never quite recovers. It is the elevator that skips the 3rd floor if you don't hold the button for a full 2 seconds. It is the particular creak of my office chair, at the point where the hydraulic cylinder is giving up. 19 years is muscle memory and institutional knowledge, and 100 small calibrations that nobody writes down because nobody expects them to disappear. I was 46 years old. I had managed this company's finances through 2 recessions, a supply chain crisis, a warehouse fire, a hostile acquisition attempt, and the slow, grinding years after Arthur stepped back. My team ran 7 figures of monthly reconciliation without breaking a sweat. I knew where every dollar went, had known for nearly 2 decades, and more to the point, I knew where every dollar was supposed to go. That distinction matters. That distinction is the whole story. Elaine Vale had taken over as CEO 4 years before. She was a capable administrator, polished where Arthur had been rough-hewn, boardroom fluent where he'd been factory floor intuitive. They were opposites in almost every way, but I respected her. Arthur had trusted her to maintain what he'd built, and for 3 years, she did. Then her daughter married Martin Vale. Martin arrived at the company 6 months before the morning of the cardboard box. His official title was Chief Transformation Officer, a role that had been created specifically for him, which should have told me something. He was 34, and he had the particular confidence of a man who had been told he was exceptional by people who needed him to believe it. His suits were impeccable. His handshake was calibrated. He used words like synergy and modernization and streamlining without any apparent awareness that those words had been ironic for 20 years. I noticed him the way you notice a change in weather pressure. Something in the atmosphere shifted, and your body registers it before your mind does. The first thing I noticed, he asked for vendor contract files 2 weeks after he arrived. All of them, spanning the last 5 years. Perfectly reasonable request for someone in a transformation role. I sent them. The second thing I noticed, 3 weeks later, 2 of our longest-standing vendors, both of whom we'd worked with since before the recession, received non-renewal notices. The replacements were companies I'd never heard of. The bids were higher, not dramatically higher. The kind of higher that gets approved in budget review without a second look if you're moving fast and nobody's paying close attention. I paid close attention. I always paid close attention. I pulled the new vendor registrations, ran the corporate addresses through our standard compliance database, flagged 2 of them for overlapping directory information, and sent a memo to legal. Legal sat on it. I followed up. Legal said they were reviewing. 3 weeks passed. I told myself it was bureaucratic drag. I told myself I was being paranoid, that a new executive bringing in new vendors was normal, that I was pattern matching where there was no pattern. I'd been at this company so long I'd started mistaking familiarity for correctness. I told myself a lot of things. My hands weren't shaking yet, but they would be. The 6th week after Martin arrived, I stayed late on a Thursday. Not for any particular reason, or so I told myself. I had quarterly projections to finalize, and the office was quieter at 7 p.m. Nina had gone home. The floor was empty except for the hum of servers and the occasional ping of an elevator 2 corridors over. I was running a reconciliation report when I saw it. A payment authorization, $214,000 to Meridian Consulting Group, LLC, one of the new vendors, for strategic advisory services rendered in Q3. The authorization had been signed by Martin Vale and countersigned by Elaine's executive assistant, which meant it had moved through as an operational expense, below the threshold requiring board review. I looked up Meridian Consulting Group, LLC, incorporated 11 months ago, registered agent, a law office in Delaware, listed director, a name I didn't recognize, but the address, a building in northern New Jersey, matched an address I'd seen before. I had to scroll back through the vendor files to find it. I almost missed it, but there it was. The same building, different suite number, was also the registered address for Vale Strategic Partners, a consulting group Martin had founded in 2019 before joining Tennant. I sat very still for a moment. My office was was dark, except for the monitor glow. Outside, 4 stories down, I could hear a forklift moving through the warehouse, that familiar low mechanical groan, the sound of the company I'd helped keep alive. I printed the documents, both of them, put them in a manila folder, and locked the folder in my bottom drawer. Then I closed my computer, put on my coat, and went home. I didn't sleep. By 6 a.m., I had a list, 3 vendor registrations with overlapping corporate addresses, 2 directors that traced back through shell company layers to a holding group Martin had been associated with before his marriage to Elaine's daughter, a pattern of contract awards, all in the 6 months since his arrival, that had bypassed competitive bidding in ways that were individually defensible and collectively impossible to explain as coincidence. The total? Somewhere in the range of $800,000. Possibly more if the pattern held into Q4. I needed to talk to someone. But who? Legal had sat on my first memo. The board was largely deferential to Elaine. I considered going directly to Elaine herself, but if she knew, I was done. And if she didn't know, I needed to be careful about what I was implying about her son-in-law. I made 2 decisions. I scanned everything and emailed the files to my personal account, then to a second account I hadn't used in 3 years. And I scheduled a quiet meeting with James Okafor. James was Tenet Manufacturing's outside corporate counsel, not the in-house team that reported up through Elaine's org chart, but the external firm that had handled governance and trust matters since Arthur's time. Sharp, meticulous, the kind of man who read footnotes the way other people read headlines. We'd worked together for 12 years. I trusted him. More importantly, he didn't report to Martin. I told him what I'd found. Not everything. I laid it out the way you lay out evidence, calmly, specifically, without editorializing. He listened without interrupting. Then he put down his pen and looked at me. Clara, he said carefully, you understand what this looks like. Yes, I said. And you understand the position this puts you in? Yes, I said again. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something I didn't fully understand at the time. You need to make sure your own governance position is documented and current. Don't let that lapse. I nodded, thinking it was routine caution. It wasn't routine. He knew something I hadn't fully reckoned with yet, that whoever was moving against the company would need me out of the way first. 2 weeks later, Martin Vale slid a cardboard box across my desk. The box was medium-sized, the kind of anonymous brown cardboard that could contain anything. Office supplies, files, the accumulated rubble of any working life. Inside it, already packed, my coffee mug. The ceramic one with the Tenet Manufacturing logo that was so old the letters had faded to ghost text. My TI financial calculator, the one I'd used since business school. 3 framed photographs. My daughter at 7, my husband David and me at our 20th anniversary dinner, and 1 group photo from 2009, the year we navigated the recession without a single warehouse layoff. 11 people standing in front of the factory floor, all of them grinning like they'd survived a war, which in a way they had. And the pen, the silver pen Arthur had given me, engraved with the date, March 14th, 2006. Someone had been inside my office. Someone had opened my drawers, assessed my personal belongings, and made decisions about what was important to me. Martin stood across my desk in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my first month's salary. He had the particular expression of a man performing a difficult but necessary duty, eyebrows furrowed just enough to signal regret, jaw set just enough to signal resolution. It was a very polished performance. I imagined he'd practiced it. Clara, he began, and I noticed he didn't say Ms. Mercer, which was a tell, though I filed it away without comment. We're making some significant leadership transitions as part of our modernization initiative. We value everything you've contributed to the company. The office was silent. I could feel 30 people not breathing. Martin slid a document across the desk. Separation agreement. My eyes moved over it with the practiced speed of someone who has read 10,000 financial documents. Enhanced severance, standard NDA provisions, non-disparagement clause running both ways, a release of claims. It was thorough. Someone in legal had done good work. We're modernizing leadership, Clara. You understand. I looked at the box. The pen caught the light. There is a thing that happens when you've spent 19 years pouring yourself into something, when you have genuinely loved the work, the people, the mission of a place, and then watch someone try to hollow it out from the inside. A very cold, very specific anger. Not hot, cold. The kind that doesn't make you shake or shout. The kind that makes you extremely precise. I picked up the document, folded it once, twice, and set it in the box. I'll have my attorneys review this, I said. Martin blinked. He'd expected something else. Protests, gratitude, perhaps tears. People who've had 19 years ripped away tend to produce something. He'd prepared for something. Of course, he said, recalibrating quickly. He smiled. That practiced, polished smile. You're handling this surprisingly well. I closed the box. I picked it up. Have a nice morning. His smile held for exactly 2 seconds. Then I was already walking. The 30 people still weren't breathing. Nina, by the copier, had tears running silently down her face. Our warehouse supervisor, Ray Kowalski, who had walked in for inventory reports and clearly had no idea what he was walking into, was standing in the doorway with an expression that could best be described as a man contemplating violence and thinking better of it. I didn't stop. I nodded at Ray. I walked past Nina and squeezed her arm gently as I passed. I pressed the elevator button. Held it for 2 full seconds, the way you have to, or it skips the 3rd floor. The doors opened. I stepped in. I watched the lobby rise up to meet me. Security walked me out with the particular misery of people following orders they consider shameful. The guard on the left, a man named Gerald who'd been with the building for 11 years, stairs, couldn't look at me. I didn't make it worse by looking at him. In the lobby, I passed the portrait. Arthur Tennant, rolled sleeves, sawdust on his boots, that particular no-nonsense square of the shoulders that meant he'd been building something before they took the photo and would go back to building it after. He was 61 in that portrait. The building was 12 years old. I was 22, and I had just started. He looked out from the portrait with that expression I'd known my whole life. Patient. Certain. Like he'd already accounted for every contingency. I know, I thought. I know, Grandpa. I walked out into the November morning. I sat in my car, a 2019 Volvo XC60. Silver. David calls it my sensible midlife crisis. With the cardboard box on my lap and my keys in my hand, and I did not, for one long minute, move. It was 9:22 a.m. I thought about Arthur. I thought about the warehouse workers whose jobs we'd saved in 2009 when it would have been so easy, so justifiable to cut the workforce and trim the quarterly numbers and call it strategic. I thought about what this company meant in this town. Not just the jobs, but the idea of it. That something built with intention can stay built. I thought about the vendor contracts, the shell companies, the $800,000 minimum that had moved in 6 months through channels designed not to be noticed. Martin Vale had made several mistakes, but his most catastrophic one was architectural. He'd built his plan on the assumption that I was just a long-tenured employee, a relic, someone who could be pensioned off with an enhanced severance package and a carefully worded NDA. He had never thought to ask my maiden name. In 31 years of being Clara Mercer, I had learned to let that go. People who need to know, find out. People who don't. It was not my job to volunteer it. My phone rang at 10:03. Nina. Whispering, and the whisper was vibrating with something between panic and exhilaration. Clara. Oh God, Clara, legal just opened your full personnel file. The governance file. He is in the boardroom right now. Clara. He's screaming. I could hear faintly through the phone the particular acoustics of the 4th floor conference room. That room has terrible soundproofing. I've complained about it for 11 years. What is he saying? He's shouting. Clara Tennant. Who is she? Why does this name appear in the governance documents? What does this mean? I looked at the lobby doors. Through the glass, I could see Arthur's portrait, just the edge of it, from this angle. Nina. I said, yes? Tell him I'm the woman he needed permission to fire. A pause. I could hear her breath catch, then quietly. Oh my God. I'll be back in 15 minutes. I said, call James Okafor. Tell him it's time. I set the box in the back seat. I smoothed my coat. I started the car. Here is what Martin Vale did not read. When Arthur Tennant stepped back from active management 9 years ago, he spent 14 months with James Okafor and a team of trust and estate attorneys restructuring his ownership stake. Arthur was not a sentimental man in the conventional sense. He didn't make speeches about legacy or call his grandchildren in for dramatic announcements. He expressed love through architecture. He built structures that would persist. He placed 38% of Tennant Manufacturing into a family trust, the Tennant Family Governance Trust, formally established under Delaware law with James Okafor as co-trustee. 38% was a specific and careful number, not majority control, enough to block fundamental restructuring decisions, enough to trigger mandatory review under the company's foundational documents if certain governance conditions were violated. The trust had one operating requirement. At all times, one Tennant family member in good standing must hold a senior operational role within the company, specifically in finance, labor relations, or vendor ethics oversight, and must remain in that role absent cause, board consensus, and trust officer approval. This was not buried language. It was in the governance appendix of the company's foundational documents, incorporated by reference into every executive employment agreement, and cross-referenced in the shareholder agreement that every board member signed. Nobody reads appendices. That's the thing about power. The real, structural, foundational kind. It doesn't announce itself. It sits quietly in footnotes and cross-references, invisible to people who are looking for it in the wrong places. Martin had looked for my power in my job title, in my expense reports, in whatever leverage he imagined a woman with 19 years of institutional knowledge might be able to scrape together. He hadn't looked in the governance documents. He hadn't asked himself, why has this particular person been in this particular role, in this particular company for 19 years, through 4 different leadership regimes, without a single involuntary departure? I'll tell you why. Not because I was the most impressive financial professional to pass through Tennant Manufacturing. We've had brilliant people come and go. But because my grandfather built a structure that required me to be here, and because for 19 years I had chosen to honor that trust not as an obligation, but as a conviction. Because I believed what he believed, that a company built on workers' hands should have someone in the room whose job is to listen when workers speak. That was the job. The real job underneath the title. Martin had fired the wrong woman, and now it was 10:14 a.m., and I was walking back toward the building. I parked in the same spot I'd left 47 minutes earlier. Gerald held the lobby door. He looked like a man who had been told something was happening but didn't know what, and whose better instincts were winning. I nodded at him and walked to the elevator. Behind me came James Okafor, carrying a leather briefcase he'd had for 20 years. Beside him, Margaret Chen, one of the 2 trust officers, who was small and precise and wore an expression of neutral authority that I had always found deeply reassuring. Behind her, a second trust officer, David Park, who had driven down from the state capitol at James's call that morning. The 4 of us rode the elevator in silence. At the 4th floor, I stepped out first. The hallway was that that particular species of quiet that means people are trying very hard to look like they're not watching. I could see through the glass wall of the conference room several figures around the table. I could see Martin standing. He never sits when he's agitated, I'd noticed that, gripping something at the far end. I could see Elaine Vale at the head of the table, her back very straight, her face a composition that had taken a great deal of effort to assemble. I opened the conference room door. The room held Elaine Vale, CEO, 4 board members, including Chairman Richard Holt, who had been on the board since Arthur's time, the company's in-house general counsel, Patricia Marsh, 41 years in corporate law, 2 members of legal, and Martin Vale, who was holding my personnel file like it had personally offended him. Why wasn't this in her profile? Martin demanded, to no one in particular, as I walked in. His voice had the strained, slightly too high quality of a man who is used to controlling rooms and currently does not control this one. James set his briefcase on the conference table with a quiet click. It was in her profile, he said, specifically in the governance appendix, cross-referenced in sections 4, 7, and 11 of the foundational employment documentation. You failed to read it. A pause. Nobody reads appendices, Martin said. He actually said this. I will carry the memory of his face in that moment, the genuine, bewildered indignation of a man who believes that ignorance of a rule is the rule's failing, not his own. Richard Holt, who had been on this board for 19 years and who I had watched age from a vigorous 60 into a still formidable 79, looked at Martin with an expression I can only describe as the particular disappointment of a man who has seen many things and hoped to see fewer of this variety. People who are firing protected officers read appendices, he said. The room was very still. Martin's eyes found me. He looked at me the way you look at something when your brain is still processing that it doesn't match the category you'd filed it under. Mercer, he said, like a question, like the name was a door he was pushing and finding it didn't open. My married name, I said. You never asked. Margaret Chen stepped forward and laid 3 documents on the conference table. Ms. Tenant Mercer's termination, as effected this morning at 9:14 a.m., triggers Article 9 of the Tenant Family Governance Trust Agreement, which constitutes a material governance breach. Per the terms of that breach, all restructuring activities initiated or authorized by the terminating officer are immediately suspended pending review. All vendor contracts entered into within the officer's tenure are subject to audit, and the terminating officer is themselves subject to a full review of their institutional conduct. Martin laughed. I want to be precise about this. He actually laughed, a short, confident, reflexive sound. The laugh of a man who is certain the other people in the room are confused about something fundamental. This is a misunderstanding, he said. I was streamlining operations. Nobody disputes that the company needed. I opened the second folder. I'd had it in my bag since the night before. James had reviewed it. Margaret and David Park had reviewed it. Patricia Marsh, general counsel, who did not report to Martin and whose 18-year relationship with this company predated his marriage, had reviewed it at 7 a.m. that morning and had gone very quiet for a long time before saying, yes, this is what it looks like. I laid the documents on the table, not with drama, the way you lay out a quarterly report, methodically, specifically, so that everyone present can see the same thing at the same time. Corporate registration documents for Meridian Consulting Group, LLC. Corporate registration for 2 additional vendor entities. Shared registered addresses. Overlapping director names. The thread connecting all of them through 2 layers of holding structure to Vale Strategic Partners. Martin's pre-marriage consulting firm. Payment authorizations. $214,000, $187,000, $143,500, $92,000, a smaller amount of $61,200, and several still pending. And 1 email, retrieved from the company server under a legal hold James had quietly initiated 4 days prior, printed clean on white paper. The email was from Martin's personal account to an address registered to the Delaware law office that had set up the shell companies. It was dated 6 weeks ago, 3 weeks after I had sent my first memo to legal, the one that had sat without response. Get Clara out first, the email read. She'll recognize the vendor names. Once she's gone, we have runway through Q2. Elaine Vale had not moved. She was still at the head of the table with her perfectly assembled face and her perfect posture, and she was reading the documents without expression, the way people read things when they are trying to understand whether what they are reading is actually what they are reading. The room was completely silent. Martin was no longer laughing. I watched his face, watched the actual process of realization, which is a slower and stranger thing than people expect. First, the laugh aided, then his jaw tightened, then his eyes moved across the documents, and his throat moved in a dry swallow. Then he looked up at me, and for one moment, just one, his face was entirely unguarded. He understood. He had not fired a long-tenured employee who knew too much. He had fired the one person who already knew everything, who had the structural authority to bring it all down, who had been quietly documenting it for weeks, who had allies he'd never considered, and who walked out with a cardboard box because she was not afraid of what came next. He had fired a tenant, and then he'd handed her the authority to walk back in. Elaine set down the email. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. Martin, a pause. What exactly did you do? He stopped trying to find an answer. He looked like a man watching a tide go out and understanding, too late, that he is standing in the wrong place. What followed was not a movie scene. Justice in real life is slower, more procedural, and considerably less cinematic than people expect. But it is also, in its grinding way, thorough. Patricia Marsh initiated an immediate forensic accounting audit. The firm, Deloitte, brought in by the board with a specific mandate to trace all vendor contracts authorized within the past 6 months. They spent 3 weeks with our records. The number, when it was finalized, was $1.4 million. Not the $800,000 I had estimated. I had underestimated how many transactions had already cleared Q4 processing. A full third of it was traceable directly to Meridian Consulting, with an additional 4 entities that the audit identified through the overlapping structure. The SEC referral was made by the board on a Thursday afternoon in December. I was not in the room when it was made, but James Okafor called me at 4:17 p.m. "It's done," he said. Martin Vale resigned from his position as Chief Transformation Officer at 9 a.m. the following Monday. The statement cited personal reasons. Nobody believed it, and nobody was meant to. Martin and his wife separated 6 weeks later. I know this not because I track him, but because small towns, and this is, in its way, a small town even wearing a company's clothes, do not keep secrets well. The SEC investigation was ongoing as of the last time I spoke to James. Wire fraud, securities violations in connection with the fabricated board approvals, breach of fiduciary duty. I am told the Delaware law office that established the shell companies is cooperating. Elaine Vale remained as CEO. This surprised some people, but it made sense to me. She had been deceived, and her record over 3 years before Martin's arrival was solid. The board required a full governance review and the implementation of enhanced vendor compliance procedures, which my team spent February designing. I was consulted extensively because institutional knowledge doesn't pack neatly into a cardboard box no matter how carefully you've organized it. I was offered my position back, full reinstatement, back pay for the period of termination, a formal apology from the board. I accepted. Of course I accepted. What was I going to do? Let someone else watch the accounts? It's been 7 months. The silver pen is back on my desk. The photographs are back. The calculator is back, and my coffee mug, though someone chipped it in the repacking and there's a small divot in the logo now that wasn't there before. I've left it. I kind of like the reminder. Nina brought me breakfast burritos my first morning back. Ray Kowalski, the warehouse supervisor, shook my hand with both of his, which is the most emotional I have ever seen him, and he has been here longer than I have. People ask me sometimes what it felt like. Walking out with that box, sitting in my car, walking back in, honestly, the box felt light, lighter than I expected, because the things that matter, the relationships, the knowledge, the 19 years of understanding exactly where the bodies are buried, you don't carry those in a cardboard box. They're already inside you. Nobody can pack them up and send them home. Martin Vale never understood that. He thought he was removing a piece from the board. He didn't realize the piece he was removing was also the board. Arthur Tennant built this company with his hands and a bone-deep belief that the people who show up every day and do the work deserve someone in the building who is paying attention. For 19 years, I tried to be that person. I'll try for another 19. The portrait is still in the lobby. Arthur, rolled sleeves, sawdust on his boots, that expression of patient, permanent certainty. Every morning when I walk in, I nod at it. He always knew I'd handle it. He just built the structure to make sure I could.